Hello.
Hello. How's it going?
Yeah, not bad, man. How are you?
Probably better rested than you are.
Well, I'm starting to sound like a broken record if I complain about being sleep deprived. I'm far more sleep deprived than I was last week, but I already complained about that last week, so I feel like the boy who cried sleep deprived.
Well, hopefully you can manage all right. I know Whitehead says fatigue is the antithesis of reason.
Does, doesn't
So
he?
if you need to stray into anarchy, well, I'll make extra allowances.
Yeah, I'm reasonably comfortable in the domain of anarchy. Obviously, I think that's where we have to go ultimately. If we're going to follow the evolutionary account to the hilt all the way, we're going to end up in something anarchic.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, um, I thought it might make sense for us to start with just a little bit of historical context on this book,
Yeah, let's
the
do it.
function of the function of reason. These were lectures at Princeton University in March of 1929, and Whitehead had already given his Gifford lectures. If Process and Reality wasn't published yet, it was at least finished as far as Whitehead's composition of it. Um,
Big year for him.
Huge year for him, and a lot of the ideas that he works out in Process and Reality do get at least a mention. I mean, he throws in actual occasions of experience at one point. Um, he's been at Harvard for 5 years now in the time that he was giving these lectures. And I think it's important to recognize the influence of a couple of biologists who are at Harvard on Whitehead. Um, One was Lawrence Henderson, who was a physiologist. He wrote this book called The Fitness of the Environment.
I have that book.
Nice. Yeah.
I
Oh,
have
cool.
not. Yeah, I haven't read it, but I do have it. Yeah.
That was 1913. And Henderson in that text is basically arguing that there's a kind of continuity between cosmic and biological evolution. Actually, let me just read one of my favorite quotes from that book. He says, the properties of matter and the course of cosmic evolution are now seen to be intimately related to the structure of the living being and to its activities. They become, therefore, far more important in biology than has previously been suspected. For the whole evolutionary process, both cosmic and organic, is one, and the biologist may now rightly regard the universe in its very essence as biocentric.
Mm.
So this is what the biologists at Harvard are telling Whitehead. Um, and then there's also William Wheeler, who's a an entomologist, and he wrote a book in 1928 called Emergent Evolution, um, which talks about the need to balance a sense of genetic continuity with the novelty in evolution. Um, and he thinks, the emergence of life and mind only makes sense as continuous, um, sort of gradual developments, and that there wouldn't have been a time where all of a sudden we have life, whereas before there was utterly nothing at all like that. Similarly with mind. And so this idea of emergent evolution, I mean, certainly emergence plays a role, but the idea that these levels like life and mind could have emerged from something that had no inkling of even a suggestion that they might come on the scene is not the type of emergence he's talking about. And so that's another important influence on Whitehead, a sense that there are these cumulative processes that can gradually lead to the increased exemplification or the increased expression of something that was had to have been in germ beforehand, right? So I think these
And
two.
that I would just say really briefly is kind of ultra orthodox Darwinism, because gradualism is certainly the thesis with regard to change that becomes and would have even been at that point the orthodox Darwinian position. They wouldn't necessarily have extended it to origin of life. I mean, Darwin himself said that speculating about the origin of life was like speculating about the origin of matter. You know, he basically said, I've got no idea. And certainly
He
because
does say something about a warm little pond with some important ingredients in it, but
he does, yeah. But as far as mind is concerned, etc., of course, it would also be orthodox Darwinian to be more of a mechanical philosopher, right? And
I
but
think we're
nonetheless,
talking, I
yeah.
think there's two different levels going on here. Gradualism in the sense of the matter, life, mind distinctions, and then gradualism at the level of speciation. And I think there might be some reason to question, I mean, punctuated equilibria and whatnot when we're talking about speciation. And Whitehead would indeed say speciation can often occur as a result of an organism making a decision to clutch after some novelty that would be risky, and the alternative would be to fall into a kind of life tedium and maintain a stable method, which ultimately leads to decay and possibly extinction. And so at the level of speciation, I think Whitehead's not a gradualist, but at the level of these major distinctions that we would make between, say, matter, life, and mind, there's where the gradualism comes in, right? And so I think it's important to distinguish these two questions.
I do think that's important. What I was getting at is that it's a generalization, just as Whitehead himself describes it, right, of Darwinian principles beyond the strictly biological realm, in a sense. So it's saying, well, if we have this gradualist way of understanding things, then this should, and there's no, let's say, logical reason, there's really no empirical reason, there's no principled reason, though, why this wouldn't extend, you know, beyond the biological. And I think we should get into that because I think we should at least touch on, you know, my working memory and lucidity. Uh, if it allows that, but systems chemistry and things that you know like do give us gradualist accounts today of, say, the origin of life in a you know systematic, scientific manner. And really, the way those things have been framed, and a very reasonable way of framing them, is the extension of Darwinian principles. You know, backwards, so to speak. And I think that actually is also very consistent with the thing that Whitehead says numerous times in Function of Reason, which is that, you know, reductionists always want to generalize from the, you know, what's considered the prior forms or the simpler forms to the more complex forms, whereas it might be equally justified to do some kind of reverse generalization. And there are lots of nuts and bolts and devils in the details there. And you're absolutely right that Orthodox Darwinian thought at this time would certainly not be gradualist about some. They wouldn't even be thinking about necessarily some of those things. They would just be like the issue of mind would just be elided in the way that it traditionally has been in reductionist science, which again is a key issue that Whitehead is talking about in this piece. Anyway, I didn't want to derail you with that. I was just saying that
No,
that
no, I think that's all relevant and important. And as I think it's either Deleuze and I think it's Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy? They talk about how the history of science has these conceptual personae that, like Darwin or Mendel or um, Newton, that stand in for the names are used in the theories, and we personalize the theory. And I think, all due respect to Darwin, he's a genius. Evolution as such, particularly if we're seeking a general theory of evolution, I think we can, of course, Wallace is a co-discoverer, but even beyond the two of them, evolution was in the air, for a century or more. And I think it's not just the extension of evolutionary principles, not just Darwinian principles, because he has a very specific take on it, which can be generalized. But I think Darwin's formulation might be narrower, at least, than I would prefer when it comes to the general theory of evolution that we're seeking.
For sure. I think we've talked about this a number of times. You know, we can be very specific about what Darwin does and doesn't contribute, and we can also you can get into the weeds about what is referred to as Darwinism that isn't actually Darwinian as well, and we've talked about that a number of times. So the idea that Darwin is explaining purpose away as opposed to naturalizing purpose, for example, like the reductionist idea that he would be explaining purpose away is absolutely at odds with Darwin's own project. Darwin's project is naturalizing purpose, and that's very clear, especially in The Descent of Man.
Mhm.
Uh, so what is and isn't Darwinian is indeed, it's a doxographical question of
Mhm.
some considerable import. Because I mean, Darwin was a very humble guy, and he was very much restrict. I mean, Wallace's co-discoverer 20 years later, right? So Darwin had the principle of natural selection and was sitting on it for 20 years, gathering empirical evidence and doing experiments, studying his worms and barnacles and orchids and the rest.
Don't forget his beetles.
Yeah.
He loved his
Um,
beetles.
yeah. And then he was essentially forced to publish by Wallace, who was a very very different personality and sort of intellectual type in almost every respect. So Wallace has famously has the flash of insight for natural selection in a malarial fever dream.
Mhm.
um, but he's very lucid in the way that he explains it. Darwin says, I find myself now adopting his terms. And this is also relevant to this notion of survival of the fittest, which I think we're going to have to get to very
Yeah.
shortly. Um, Darwin is ready to adopt the pithy, um, you know, slogans, uh, and the language of others, basically, because he's willing to efface himself at most turns.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so his designs are not to have this grand cosmological thesis
Oh
either. His
no,
designs are to try to
not at
make,
all. He refers to the fixed law of gravity and, gives the physical world to Newton and says, this is only applicable to the biological world. And we're trying to, I think, bridge there, as is Whitehead. Um,
I think just to finish this little line of thought, when I say the generalizing of Darwinism, it's essentially the impact that Darwin had on the thought of his time. For sure, of course, evolution is this big, Victorian era obsession with and it's capital P progress, association with capital P progress. And Darwin doesn't even use the term evolution in the first edition of On the Origin of Species because he doesn't want to be associated with this notion of progress, because actually part of his innovation is to suggest that we can have evolution without progress. But so he doesn't use that term. But he has
Transformism, right?
yeah. So but he has a huge impact basically on subsequent thinkers, obviously like Whitehead, obviously Peirce, but across the board. And part of that is just through proposing a principle that grounds the scientific investigation of evolution, basically, that takes it out of the more speculative philosophy realm. I mean, again, it's there in paleontology. It's all over the place, right? It's not that he is unique in this regard either, but he makes a unique contribution to grounding the science of evolutionary biology, and that is great fuel for the thought of the great generalizers who come immediately thereafter, like Whitehead and Peirce.
And just to note, as Darwin himself admits in Origin of Species, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was a huge influence on him, and Goethe was influenced by people like Herder and Schelling, and so
Humboldt, Humboldt,
Humboldt, yeah, exactly, yeah. The whole trip of the HMS Beagle was inspired by Humboldt's journey to South America. So there's a lot there. The Germans helped out quite a bit. Um, so just in terms of the context, when Whitehead's giving these lectures, the last thing I would say is that, the 1920s are also when we're seeing the rise of logical positivism and behaviorism. And so a lot of what Whitehead seems to be railing against um, might not seem as urgent nowadays, though there are still plenty of scientific thinkers for whom the idea of final causality must still be ruled out of court, even though, as you're saying, it played a role in Darwin's understanding of animal life. Certainly, it's a for Whitehead plainly evident that in the animal kingdom and in human beings, including scientists, purpose, final causality is just a hardcore common sense fact about our experience, right? That we only deny when we have become captured by a particular method that might be very effective within its own domain and its own limits, but often these very effective methods become unaware of their limitations and attempt to apply themselves to everything. And so the evidence of purpose can't even be seen from within that methodological narrowing. And so it's in this context, that he's suggesting that we really need to pay more respect to speculative reason, theoretical reason, because he thinks we're at risk, even if we take the Darwinian approach, at only understanding reason as pragmatic, as instrumental, as something that is very useful for animals to pursue their own survival. But he thinks that and it's not that he wants these to be two totally separate types or factors, though he's speaking in that way. But I think this is a kind of reductio argument to say, hey, there's something missing if we only focus on this. There's also this. How can we harmonize these two aspects? But he wants to hold out for this more Platonic form of reason and say that it's not just Ulysses' form of cleverness and pragmatic, fox-like intelligence that is evident in at least among human beings, though he admits this deeper form of reason that he refers to as, responsible for the upward trend of evolution, which I know, is suggestive of this Victorian obsession with progress. And I think we're going to need to dig in there a little bit and save Whitehead from his own cultural inheritance there, which I don't think is too hard to do because there are counter tendencies in his thought too. But this emphasis on the importance of speculative reason, I think, is coming in the midst of the 1920s, where he saw the writing on the wall. There was this real danger of science and a particularly narrow positivist form of anti-metaphysical philosophy, if we can even still call it philosophy, as just taking the reins and running with it. And he worried that would lead to, ultimately science not being able to understand itself, and adopting a kind of naive metaphysics that it wouldn't refer to as a metaphysics, namely materialism. And so I think his exasperation and some funny jokes too, I think are best understood in that context, right? This is the late 1920s we're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that the dominant, paradigm in evolutionary biology at that time is the sort of August Weismann type argument against neo-Lamarckianism as well, and so the ultra reductionist view of things, and again, it's like, what is Darwinian, what isn't Darwinian? The whole stoush between um, the essentially genetic, the emerging field of genetics, and the neo-Lamarckians concerns the possibility of, I mean, it's basically almost like Weissmann's germplasm theory is not that dissimilar. I mean, it's like it becomes the central dogma of molecular biology, and it's that path towards the selfish gene, right? All the action is happening in the genes. It's a pathway towards genetic determinism. The bodies are just vehicles for these replicators that that we're propagating. So we're epiphenomenal essentially. And the major competition then is with neo-Lamarckianism, which is sort of saying that there's inheritance of acquired characteristics, and so the behavior of the organism and what it does during its life is massively influential on what in fact gets passed on, and Weissman famously like cuts off the tails of mice and breeds them, and the babies have full tails, and this is a triumph for the
Proof.
genetic theory, the germplasm theory. And again, the question of what is Darwinian and what isn't Darwinian, it just arises here again, because there was no dispute between Lamarck and Darwin. I mean, there was no direct dispute, obviously, but there was no just theoretical dispute on whether or not acquired characteristics could be inherited. Darwin has a principle of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So, strictly speaking, it's not Darwinian to say that there are no there's no inheritance of acquired characteristics, and Lamarck is the antithesis, that evolution is driven by the inheritance of acquired characteristics, because Darwin believed that that was a factor in evolution too. So again, it is exactly as you say, the sort of conceptual personae that become quite different from the thinkers themselves. It's a
Mhm.
certain buggering to stay in the Deleuzian, but I think it's Deleuze, when buggering other philosophers, wants to give them the offspring that would be recognizable to them as the fruits of their own thought, right? And I think a lot of what has gone by the name of Darwinism would not be recognizable, and certainly not something that Charles Darwin would have wanted. I mean, look, I can't speak for the guy, but I think there are a lot of things, a lot of extrapolations from his thought that he probably would have been very uncomfortable with. I think, well, they clearly were even at the time, but this is not the discussion that we're going to have today. Yeah, look, I think it's super important, all that context that you've given, because I do actually think there's a bunch of stuff that Whitehead says here. That, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that I really love. So his reductios of reductionism, fantastic. He is very funny. Um, Scientists exercised by the purpose of refuting their own purposiveness or whatever, are an interesting object for study. Not the exact quote, but um, he's very amusing, and not only here, of course. He can be quite amusing with his satire and his reductios. So I appreciate that. I'm fully on board with him, of course, in all the arguments against determinism and the inappropriate generalization of what he characterizes as the physiologists. There's the nothing buttery of physiology.
Well, note
Um,
he doesn't go after Darwin. He goes after the physiologists who have this more reductionistic and the beginnings of molecular biology at that time, so I think that's a lot has changed now,
yeah.
for sure. On that front, we have evolutionary developmental biology, which, recognizes, as Darwin did, the importance of embryological changes in giving rise to new species and whatnot. And, you know, as our friend Mike Levin is fond of pointing out, it's difficult to observe the process of embryogenesis and not see purpose there, and not see a kind of agency, collective agency, but nonetheless agency at work there.
And of course, Raymond Rouillet would say our friend Raymond Rouillet would say very similar things, and that he would again, with a rhetorical flourish, say that the embryo is smarter than a brain because it made the brain.
Mm,
Um,
right.
you know,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Just one of these jokes that Whitehead says that I wanted to share, in case I don't forget it, is, despite his defense of speculative reason, he admits that most of the professed seers in history have been a shady lot with a bad reputation. And he says, on the whole, the odds are so heavily against any particular prophet that apart from some method of testing, perhaps it is safer to stone them, in some merciful way, he adds.
yeah, I love that. Stone them yeah, merciful stoning. It's a very interesting concept. Yeah, so I'm fully on board with a lot of the thrust of his argument here. I think there's space for two things. There's space for critiquing what is dated in the expression of his argument, which is why the context is super important. Whitehead couldn't have anticipated non-equilibrium statistical mechanics or dynamic kinetic stability in systems chemistry, and I mean he anticipates these things in the structure of his thought in a fascinating way, but he couldn't necessarily have anticipated how a principle like quote unquote survival of the fittest would in fact describe very well what's going on with chemical systems that are prebiotic. Um, in fact, I would say Peirce anticipates this better than Whitehead, but there are issues with with Peirce's generalizations as well. But certainly, one of the interesting things is that Whitehead is critiquing a certain generalization, the reductionist generalization, but he's not critiquing generalization in general. He does, as you mentioned, I think already, say that that the natural selection generalization is the survival of the fittest generalization is one of the greatest generalizations in the history of science. And then, of course, he's pursuing, as we've already said, his own project of speculative generalization of, broadly speaking, evolutionary principles into the cosmological domain. And of course, he means something slightly different by cosmology than the contemporary science of cosmology means. Obviously, the contemporary science of cosmology is, trivially evolutionary. It's an evolutionary science. There's no question of that. But it's not about the the way in which, as you were saying for Lawrence, the cosmic context of life per se.
Yeah.
Um,
No, life and mind may as well not exist in physical cosmology. Whitehead's doing philosophical cosmology, which would include physics, but also the fact that there are physicists.
yeah, and he's doing organicist cosmology, right? And I mean that is the original cosmology in
Mm.
some important sense, but it's not what contemporary cosmologists understand themselves to be doing, I would think,
I
generally.
mean, not physical cosmologists, no, but there's still philosophical cosmology.
100%, yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
just that because of, as Whitehead describes happening 100 years ago already, science has attempted to go its own way and imagining that its method makes no metaphysical presuppositions whatsoever. And he points out induction and observation of, he makes this distinction between what can be observed and what is observable, where there's a kind of potentiality to that latter framing of what's observable versus what's already been observed. And he points out the speculative impetus behind something like electromagnetic theory and so on, that Whitehead's point is science has never survived without philosophy and could never survive without it. But we've gone 100 years since his warning, with science increasingly, with some notable exceptions, trying to pretend like it doesn't need a philosophical ground or has no metaphysical presuppositions. And that ends in a kind of obscurantism, according to Whitehead, which I think is largely where we're at now. And I mean, he also discusses the role that technology and technological application increasingly came to play in the development of scientific theories. He points to the steam engine as the point where that really accelerated. And in the 20th century, it's now in the 21st century, particularly, really difficult to pry apart scientific understanding from technological application, to the point where, because we have an exciting and economically quite lucrative form of, say, artificial intelligence and all of its applications, we no longer even, except in some rare instances, question the extent to which that particular technoscientific paradigm is adequate for understanding, say, human cognition or human consciousness, right? And so the capture of science as a kind of theoretical understanding, which is veering more towards the speculative reason side, by technology and practical application, I think has led to a really tragic situation. And so I think, part of what I think our project is to like tease that apart a little bit and not get so carried away, because we're so excited about the technology that we forget that actually we're obscuring the real issues here in terms of understanding what thinking is, cognition, what consciousness is, and so on, right? And so in some ways, the Whitehead was, making claims in the 1920s that aren't as relevant now. I think there's still a lot that's prescient here that remains somewhat urgent from my point of view.
No, I completely agree, and I think a key thing that you're articulating there, but just to highlight, is the way the technical applications, the technological applications colonize the speculative reason. So
Mm,
they become, so that, there might be a disavowal of speculative reason, there might be a disavowal of the metaphysical presuppositions, but in the process of that disavowal, the metaphysical presuppositions, which are, nonetheless operative, are being colonized by the technological application. So I mean, and the steam engine is a fantastic example. So the generalization of the thermodynamics of closed systems to the universe as a whole is one of the places where we get a lot of, pernicious notions in the speculative philosophy of science today that need to be critiqued, and their historical origin absolutely needs to be drawn out and deconstructed for precisely that reason. So no, I,
right.
I totally agree. My concern is like, I think there's tons here that can be absolutely deployed in a contemporary discourse. Whitehead's very useful for that. It's a wonderful read. It's a great little book. I really like it. But when one is looking to crib certain things from it that inform one's thought, that would inform one's intervention into a contemporary discourse, one then necessarily needs to separate what is still current from what is dated. And even though what is those things are very, they interpenetrate each other, and a lot of the discourse, as we've discussed, off, not on videos so much, but maybe also, is characterized by an inertia that Whitehead is still speaking to. You can still use Whitehead's arguments specifically to deconstruct this inertia that's very, very prevalent in the current discourse surrounding science. But there are ways in which the science has also moved on and that haven't necessarily had the feedback on the speculative philosophy that it might have, that it should have. And that's where we could get into some trouble by simply adopting all of Whitehead's positions.
Mm,
So some of his critiques and even some of his positive proposals, I think, are not necessarily what we would want, or perhaps even, well, yeah, we would want or need in the current discourse. And so again, I do agree with you that he's engaged in this reductio. So he's saying, to the extent that the reductionist, nothing but physiology, deterministic mode of which he's likening to pure practical reason, is not sufficient to explain the empirical facts of evolution. Yes, that's true. But his response to that is to stay at the same level in this text, really, is to erect a counter thesis, which is, we need a counteracting force to the force of decay. We need, and it's really central to his thesis here, the threefold urge, not just to live better, to my working memory is shot this morning, but his
to live
threefold:
well, to live better. Hmm.
live well to live better, exactly. And so he thinks we need to, the way he presents things. Now you can say that really, in his more speculative philosophy, he's leading us to a position which would unify those two, principles, or those two forces, or those two drives in something, singular. Um, which would be, I think, the right way to go. And in fact, the way that evolutionary theory itself leads us, in my view. Um, but that's not what he presents here. So if we are taking this text specifically, then I think he's saying we need this coordinate power. We need, okay, so yes, we can acknowledge that there is decay in the universe. Yes, we can acknowledge that there is survival of the fittest, but these are not sufficient. We need a counter thesis, basically. And I think the answer to what's insufficient, particularly about the speculative cosmology derived from the thermodynamics of closed systems, which is the decay thesis. What's insufficient about that is not really best addressed by erecting a counter thesis.
Is it a counter thesis or Whitehead pointing to facts that cannot, it's not a counterfactual, it's actual facts that he's pointing to that aren't accounted for by the thesis of degradation.
I mean, he does say that, but yeah, I haven't got the notes to pull the
It
specific
seems to
quote.
me his references to the counteragency and to the upward trend that he's trying to point to observations, not proposing a new principle or a new theory. He's pointing to evidence that is not accounted for in conservation law or in the survival of the fittest account of evolution. That would be my
Hmm.
maybe generous reading, but that's how I'm reading it here.
I would need a specific quote to really zero in on where, and I know it's in here somewhere, but where he actually discusses that. If you've got a page reference for where he mentions the counter agency, it would be worth perhaps pulling that out and reading because he mentions it a number of times. But I think it's there in his threefold urge that we've just described as well, and it's really in his assertion that survival of the fittest. And again,
Mhm.
we have to point out that's a Spencerian term. It's not a Darwinian term. Darwin adopted it, yes. But what's interesting is that what Darwin rejects in Herbert Spencer's view of evolution, and Spencer is one of the great, I mean, great in terms of influence and all that, generalizes of evolution, but not great in terms of the way we would want to generalize it because he's a thoroughly reductionist and mechanical thinker. But he is very committed to the Victorian notion of progress. And it really seems like whilst rejecting survival of the fittest, and we can talk about how generalizable that thesis is, that particular principle, and whether that's actually not already at a more fundamental level in a certain sense than the decay and upward trend principles or observations that Whitehead is mentioning. Um, but yeah, so Whitehead wants to reject survival of the fittest, but retain the progress. And that is, in a sense, the opposite of the Darwinian move. The Darwinian move, of course, is to retain the notion of survival of the fittest, at least within the biological domain. But there's plenty of reason to generalize it beyond the biological domain. But again, it's not a nice coinage for people who like us who want to do this sort of generalized evolutionary cosmology because it sounds very reductionist. It also makes it sound, as we've discussed before, as though survival of the individual is important as opposed to survival of the form, so to speak, right? The form or the lineage.
Yeah.
But all of the terms in it are to be worth problematizing. But if we're generalizing the principle, what we're really saying is something more like what Peirce says, which is that things that are good at persisting tend to persist, right? So this is absolutely tautological, and that's exactly what we want. Exactly what we want from a grounding principle. We want the most impoverished, most tautological principle we can find, and that's just classical metaphysics as well, in the sense that what we are allowed to take as given for our axioms, our arche, are things that are considered self-evident. Now, obviously, making a decision about what is self-evident has been extremely problematic in the history of philosophy. What's self-evident for one group of people might, not be for another. What's masquerading as self-evident might just be an attempt to dominate some other group. Who gets to say what's self-evident is an important question, but that's not the question we are really engaging right now. If anything, if we were to take it as read that we need some kind of grounding principle just to start reasoning at all, we would want to take, this is my argument always about the in the cosmological, cosmogenic speculative metaphysics case, we would
Hmm.
want to take the absolutely most impoverished idea we could find that would, because we want the least baggage when we are starting our chain of reasoning. We don't want to be surreptitiously, cryptically importing a bunch of implications. So if we were to say things that persist or things that are good at persisting persist, it would be hard to find something more impoverished than that,
Yeah.
you know, more self-evident in a certain sense. And it's tautology, its tautological construction is what makes it self-evident. And Peirce will say that directly. Now, obviously, Peirce isn't happy to stick at that level of the thought, and eventually, as we've discussed, he moves even more than Whitehead in the direction of a creator God, at least on some personal level, which does find its way into his philosophy and his logic. But where he's really thinking about firstness first, where he's really thinking about his evolutionary triad and trying to make it as diagrammatic as possible. So as diagrammatism, diagrammatology, whatever, stripping away the garb to reveal the relations most directly there, which is what mathematics is all about as well, of course, and Whitehead will talk about that even in this essay. Um, but where he's in that mode, he is telling us things like, you know, he has a series of related tautologies, right? Um, so yes, that which persists because it's good at persisting. Things that are capable of forming habits, therefore persist. Things that aren't capable of forming habits don't persist tautologically, again, because they can't form anything stable. A habit is just a stable form. So if you can't form any kind of stability, if you can't maintain any kind of stability, well, you're going to dissipate, right? That's just, again, tautological. Things that attract, Peirce says, are going to stay in a particular region of space. Things that repel are going to go off to the horizons. So Peirce gives us this opportunity to think at the most basic tautological level. And I think Whitehead kind of misses it. And again, Popper is pretty good on this too, actually, where Popper talks about evolution as a metaphysical research program. And a bunch of, evolutionary philosophers, a bunch of philosophers of biology were very pissed off that Karl Popper had said that natural selection was a tautology. I remember Michael Ruse, who is still a very an impassioned defender of the naturalization of purpose, actually, like a very interesting philosopher of biology. But at the time, I guess in the 70s, when Popper publishes about evolution as a metaphysical research program and natural selection as a tautological principle that grounds that metaphysical research program, Ruse is, up in arms. Popper doesn't understand evolution at all, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, Popper gets it in precisely this mode of speculative reason, because Popper is a classical philosopher in that sense. One of the
Mhm.
differences between Popper and Kuhn is that Popper is a kind of objective idealist about the evolution of knowledge. We don't need to get into that. Whereas Kuhn is much more kind of grounded in sociological context. Obviously, both of these theses have a lot to offer. I'm not recommending one or the other, but I'm saying that Popper gets the function of the tautology in a very, you know, in the mode of speculative reason, but basically as a logician. Of course, Whitehead is a great logician. No one's saying he's not, but he misses this, I think, where Peirce gets it, Popper gets it, because he
Hmm.
says it has devolved into a tautology. Where does he say this? Because it's right. I mean, this is really nice what he says here, because he's both right and kind of missing something, in my opinion, right? Um, this explanation has its measure of truth. It is one of the great generalizations of science. This is natural selection, obviously. But enthusiasts have so strained its interpretation as to make it explain nothing by reason of the fact that it explains everything, right? Blah, blah, blah. If the mere fact of dying out be sufficient proof of maladjustment to the environment, the explanation is reduced to a tautology. And it's like, that's not a bad thing in this sense, because I just to finish this tiny thing. I mean, I've got a lot a lot of notes on this particular section actually right at the beginning of the book, but um the grounding tautology does not pretend to be explanatory, and that's really, really important. It doesn't pretend to be explanatory of any given particular. If natural selection were explanatory of particular arrangements in biology, I wouldn't have a job. There would be no field of evolutionary biology, right? So we spend all of our time grounded with this principle of natural selection, trying to find out how that very minimal kind of constraint has in fact operated in this particular lineage that we are studying. And again, as we've discussed many times, natural selection per se is a constraint on change. So if you need a coordinate principle, it's just change. It's actual firstness itself, right? It's variation, which is there in Darwinism, right? That triad is absolutely there in Darwinism. Darwin doesn't have a mechanism for the generation of variation. We have them. We have them in massive abundance now. Darwin doesn't really think through that at the level of mechanism, which is why people famously say, it explains everything except the origin of species per se. Like it doesn't explain origins at all. Um, the reason, though, that it's not a coordinate principle, we're not talking about natural selection and variation as coordinate principles, is that variation is first. So if you're gonna go really fundamental, you're gonna get to some Heraclitean, Nietzschean, or yes, Plato in certain contexts, notion of it moves. All things are born from fire and return to fire, right? So construction and decay, complexification and decay, same principle at the fundamental level. But on the tautology thing, it doesn't purport to explain any particular. It purports to ground the possibility of explanations of particulars. And that is a very, very important distinction. And my concern with what Whitehead tries to do in positing a principle, and I do believe that he does that. I don't have the the close reading, internalized right now to justify this. Like I said, I think this would be a fantastic text for us to teach together because I think there's a lot in here that's worth drawing out and kind of critically interrogating because there's a great deal again that I like a lot. But by erecting a counter principle of complexification, I actually think that is obfuscatory because I think that's presupposing too much. Like what obfuscations are things that purport to be explanatory but are not in fact explanatory, which are actually begging the question, that are bringing the explanation into the posit itself. This is kind of why I don't like invocations of God in speculative metaphysics, but we can bracket that too. We've talked about that a lot. But tautologies don't do that. That's the whole
Yeah.
point of tautology. It doesn't purport to explain anything, and that gives
Yeah.
us the possibility of explanation.
So I think this is in the text, but maybe it's not, and this is my improvement on Whitehead's argument. But I would say that the counteragency he refers to, the complexification he refers to, is an observation and not a principle. He's not explaining anything, he's observing something. And he thinks that, as he puts it, the problem set by the doctrine of evolution is to explain how complex organisms with such deficient survival power ever evolved. And so his point here is that with the tautology you're speaking of, and I take the power of that as you're articulating it quite seriously, but he says the art of persistence is to be dead. And so yes, survival is the bare minimum. That's the minimal constraint that any organism it's going to need to meet that test, needs to continue living. But this threefold urge, again, is his way of characterizing, not explaining, but characterizing what he sees operative in the living world, where organisms are not content to merely survive. The reason that there is this movement towards comparatively forms of life that are comparatively deficient in survival power, not only relative to rocks, as he jokes, but relative to simpler forms of life, that this is suggestive to him that there's something missing from an account only in terms of natural selection. I think it's actually in Darwin already, which, you can expand natural selection to include things like sexual selection, where there's this aesthetic factor, there's this urge for satisfaction, there's the choice of organisms that can play a role, whether through the Baldwin effect, or through some kind of Lamarckian process. But the problem he's laying out here is that if survival of the fittest, or if mere survival and the tautology of natural selection were the only factor at play here, we should not, I mean, he would say we should not expect to see what he calls higher forms of life, which, how do you measure complexity? Well, this is admittedly vague. I don't think you can quantify these sorts of things, but there's a difference between a paramecium and a primate. What is that difference? It's a
Well,
difference in.
it is a really good question, and there are, as we know, lots of different ways there are ways of quantifying complexity, but nobody can agree on what the ultimate way of quantifying complexity is. Let's agree though that a paramecium. So I don't think complexity doesn't scale in the sense that um, I mean, we could argue that it does. It depends on one's conception, but doesn't necessarily. It's not additive in the sense that two cells are more complex than one cell, right?
Right. No,
What
it's qualitative. I mean, yes, we can. I think it's a qualitative distinction to say this
well,
is
well,
more complex than that.
what makes, and this is a hierarchical way of conceptualizing it, but what makes a primate or a complex multicellular organism more complex than a cell is that the cells are organized themselves into, emergent higher level structures, organs, etc. And all of this is integrated into a, an organism, an organic whole spit, as we should always spit when we say that, because there are lots of reasons to critique that, because in fact the additional principle that Whitehead doesn't really mention here, it's not the additional principle, it's the fundamental principle, which is in Deleuzian terms would be the body without organs, because there are no organic wholes in the sense that at every level within an organism there's stuff that is not integrated, because what's actually fundamental, what's actually first, is just change. And the process of evolution is all about kind of canalizing processes of change. And Whitehead is talking about this very, directly, but he's not engaging in that speculative metaphysical move here. And I would say that in general, he certainly recognizes it and gestures towards it. That's his cosmology, is creativity first, creativity with a capital C is the fundamental principle. But he moves on very quickly from that, I feel, in his scheme altogether. Um, Again, that's that's another side issue. But um, back to complexity, a paramecium or many a single-celled organism that have been around for 4 billion years in a similar form are exceptionally complex. Um, and I think that I love the rock joke. Obviously, the art of persistence is to be dead. Rock. I mean, most rocks. I mean, what is a rock? Okay, so how are we going to define the object, a rock? Um, Most rocks don't last, depending on how we define them, for as long as the lineage of, say, certain bacterial lineages or whatever. How are you going to do? How are you going to make this measure of persistence? That's one major question, because survival of the fittest is not about the persistence of the individual at all. So, you know, at some level, if you generalize that out and you really do make a cut
But that would still work. The point is the species that are simpler have been around for 4 billion years. I mean, the simplest species have been around for billions of years. The complex species last a few million. I mean, it works at the individual or the species level.
I'm going to say that that's a highly questionable assumption. I, I think what we need to do is go back.
Well, isn't it because the more complex species don't tend to persist as long precisely because they change, because of their enhanced capacity to clutch at alternatives and novelty and to not get stuck in a method.
Now we're moving in the right direction, absolutely. But again, it's at what level are you going to define persistence? So I like his little pithy, the art of persistence is to be dead thing. But in order to really sort of cash that out in a principled manner, we would need to define what exactly is surviving here. And for sure, there are rocks that are much older than life. Well, older than life by some amount. It's not that long. It's an incredibly short period of time after we start to get, solid masses of rock that life actually appears on the planet. Like it's notoriously incredible how small that period of time is. But again, and the oldest rock is in Australia, in the Pilbara in Western Australia. Um, but again, at what level are we defining persistence? Just as at what level are we defining complexity? So Whitehead rightly points out that there's sort of metaphysical baggage with certain notions that scientistic reductionist thinkers bring to bear whilst disavowing that metaphysical baggage. There's a lot of principled baggage in the concepts that Whitehead invokes here, like persistence, like these things can't go without defining complexity. We can't simply say, of course, it is the received view, and I want to get to complexity and our accounts of why there is, apparently and obviously, like I'm not denying that there's an increase in complexity, however we would define it, over the course of evolution. But the question is whether the things that Whitehead is saying are powerless to account for that. Let's not say explain, because again, the notion of explanation for me is not sufficiently developed here. Interestingly, in a essay on the function of reason, because again, just important to note, flogging the dead horse, natural selection doesn't explain anything and doesn't purport to explain anything, right? It
Well, I'm glad you say that, but that's not how Richard Dawkins would talk about natural selection.
Yeah, but he's not a philosopher and he doesn't, anyway.
No, he's a biologist, and biologists often try to make their theories explain everything about human life and life in general, right? So,
Yes, you're absolutely correct. So again, I think that it's what are we critiquing here? You are quite reasonably developing, the lines along, what Whitehead has said here, and we're not sure if he's actually saying that or if this is your more generous reading. Similarly, we're very much moving in the same direction with these thoughts, but part of it is if we're just engaging with this text, yes, Whitehead has many very reasonable targets, particularly in his time, but even today amongst the reductionist thinkers in science and philosophy. 100%, completely agree. But let me just jump back to the beginning here. I went to the end because at the end he does talk about the counter tendency. I mean, that's a place that counter tendency is different from a fundamental principle, though I would agree. Um, but where do we go here?
yeah. And just to say, he does get into what we would call explanation and what would be required for an explanation in the last chapter when he's talking about schemes of thought and how propositions outside the context of systematic schemes of thought are kind of elusive to pin down what we're even meaning when we use, you need the whole scheme of thought, a completed metaphysical system, he would say, to know what a proposition means completely with any total precision. And we never have that, but nonetheless, we can have a more systematic scheme of thought. And he thinks that without engaging in speculative reason, there's no hope for developing that type of a scheme. And so the propositions of special sciences kind of remain somewhat free floating and either overextended or not explaining much because they don't have that metaphysical background. So I think, he is hinting at what would be required for a fuller explanation, even though he's not pretending to offer that here.
I think on that, no, it's very nice what he says there, and I think he's basically talking about reference frames, even discursive frames at one level, but kind of epochal frame, obviously a very big part of his thinking, and there's much to say there. So it's within a particular epoch that a particular you know proposition is potentially understandable, right? And that epochal notion could be applied to a particular discourse. Or it could be, it's a scale-free notion of contextuality. Things are, and that's why I think this line of thought can lead us deeply into sort of Derridian deconstruction and all these. And I think there are lots of fertile ways to bring those things together. And zooming into the level of discourse and zooming out, not reducing everything to the discursive, obviously, which is a tendency that can happen on the other side of things. But yeah, so I want to try and get to this complexity thing before I fall on my face. Like I find I'm having to express things a little a little bit with a more energy. It's funny when you're really tired, or when I'm really tired, it's like overcompensating with additional energy. It's like if I don't force this out, I won't be able to say anything. So apologies for that. So here we go. Same page that I was on, I mean, lovely stuff, which I skipped. The phrase "survival of the fittest" is like the liturgical refrain of a litany chanted over the fossils of vanished species. I love it, and it's totally true. And we know, for example, that like fitness itself is impossible to define universally because it's epochal, because it's contextual. And so, going back to that notion of explanation for a second, we shouldn't expect there to be explanation. He's actually really good now. It's coming back to me, like where he talks about the scholastics and the notion of explanation that they are seeking one explanation to rule them all, kind of philosophizing. And what evolution, and particularly the kind of scientific legitimation of the evolutionary thought that is you know fully ancient, um, does is explode the possibility of that kind of explanation, because fitness, what is apt, what works in a particular context, just like a proposition in a particular discursive context, is, well, only appropriate to that particular context. And because the context changed so much, and because there is a way in which it's important for there are different strategies that organisms exploit. One is, and he does talk about this, like hyper specialization for a particular context, whereas another strategy is plasticity, being more evolvable, essentially being more adaptable, being a generalist, although those things are not necessarily fully, they're not all exact synonyms. There are details to unpack there as well. But yeah, organisms, explaining every single fact about an organism is always going to be impossible, also because of this existence of the body without organs, or the arbitrary change that exists within every layer of an organism that is not pre-canalized at that particular layer. Of course, it's pre-canalized at all sorts of layers, going back to the epochal layers, going back to the laws of physics. It's not breaking those, but it has degrees of freedom in its particular context, which are not going to be fully explicable. And this is what upsets people a lot about biology, and what makes people like Ernest Rutherford, great Australian scientist who had the physicist and the Rutherford atom and all that. Sorry, refuted by quantum mechanics, but or by Bohr in particular. Anyway, he says that physics is the only true science. All else is stamp collecting or whatever. It's because you can't have that sort of explanation in terms of pure principles in biology. You have principles to ground the possibility of an explanation of a particular, but you will never have a grounded explanation, like an axiomatic deductive explanation.
Because fitness is always local to particular times and places, not universalizable. And when we look at a species alive now and we try to trace back its lineage, I mean, we can find fossils, we can look at genetics, but we weren't there when events led to certain selection pressures. And so often, and I think you're exemplary in this respect, in not overreaching in this way, but there are so many evolutionary biologists who will try to explain current human behavior based on some just so story about what may have happened in the past. That's a kind of totally ungrounded speculation, right? That I think has the sort of patina of science, because it's an evolutionary account, but it's a bedtime story. Like it's not grounded in anything but speculation, and the attempt to justify current social injustices. I think often. I had to get in a little jab at evolutionary psychology.
No, yeah, and it's totally appropriate jab. And obviously Kipling with his notion of the just so story, and that has been invoked many times within, evolutionary theory, and Stephen Jay Gould's critique of adaptationism.
Mm.
There are all sorts of important nuances here. And there are no real excuses for the contemporary evolutionary biologist or psychologist to be thinking in such an essentializing manner. It just indicates that they haven't really thought about the principles that guide their own thought, which is again these sorts of unexamined presuppositions, and why someone like Heidegger would say, science cannot think. Um,
Which is
but
again why Whitehead's trying to carve out space for speculative reason as a real thing, right?
I love Whitehead, and he's wrong. But he's wrong about some stuff. Nonetheless, let's just try and get this one section where I can probably do a little bit of a close reading. So there is okay. Um, there are limitations to the doctrine of Malthus, for sure. I mean, it is a pernicious. There are pernicious implications of the importation of a scarcity doctrine from
Mhm.
economics into the guts of biology. Um, Again, it's all about what is the level and how much are we going to impoverish this notion if we're going to make it fundamental. But yeah, but there is another factor in evolution which is not in the least explained by the doctrine of the survival of the fittest. Why has the trend of evolution been upwards? Upwards. This is very Victorian, It's like, okay, that's arbitrary, but anyway. The fact that because this comes from the image of the pyramid with I mean with the
Right.
monarch on top, but with the human at top, the pinnacle of evolution, right? Upwards, the upwards
Mm.
trend.
And we
Um,
totally need to criticize that, but at the same time, when we look at the history of the universe, what maybe you proposed outward in our offline conversation that things move outward, not upward. And I said, well, there's also this inward uh tendency or trend. And so what are the words that we would want to use to capture the fact that the universe starts as plasma and then becomes atoms and stars and galaxies and planets and cells and plants, animals, and human beings? There's something going on there
yeah,
that we could ignore because
let's
uh
call it. Let me justify this, but first let me just say it. Let's call it niche partitioning. All right. So it's the discovery of unoccupied degrees of freedom. It's the discovery of wiggle rooms. This is why I say outwards, which doesn't preclude inwards in the sense that you want it to, because complexification and interiority, interior differentiation, and its possible relationship to introspection and our experience of inwardness and all of that. That's another thing to talk about. But
Mhm.
let's call to begin with, this differentiation, the discovery, well, the construction slash discovery, because these are like very difficult to tease apart, of additional degrees of freedom, like additional axes in some vector space. But let's call that, in a very basic way, the principle of like niche partitioning. Um, or well, let me try and cash that out a little bit, yeah, because I want to try and give an account of the evolution of complexity. I want to read the thing from Whitehead where he says this absolutely cannot account for it, and then I want to say how it does, or how, again, how lucid I'm going to be, I don't know. This is not going to settle the issue once and for all. Of course, it would if I'd had a good night's sleep, but I went to
Well,
see just
I'll
just
play
for
with a handicap.
I went to see Tom York. Went to see Tom York last night, and as the father of a small child, as I've said before, um, you know, my wife and I, we get out very rarely, and it was a great concert. It was marred by a bit of a crowd incident right at the end,
Hmm.
but it was a fantastic concert. Well, right at the end, Tom was giving his, thank you. You've been a great audience. It's a privilege. I want to thank the band, Radiohead. I want to thank the other band, The Smile. Every time I touch any of this equipment, he's got all these instruments on. So he was doing heaps of looping, and it was a really big retrospective, heaps of Radiohead stuff. It was really an amazing gig. Everything from him just doing solo guitar and singing, obviously, and solo piano pieces to doing a lot of electronica, of course, which has always been a big part of his music. But so triggering loops and then improvising over the top of them and singing, like it was great. I mean, we weren't as close as I would have liked to be. The difference between like, life-changing experience and this is great can be like 100 meters at a gig, often. But right at the end, someone who was sitting, and this is not not a place I want this conversation to go, but someone who was sitting in the super expensive seats, well, in the seats, all of the seats were like over $200. Um, I mean, maybe they snuck in, but right as he's thanking the audience and just about to play the third song of the encore, his very last thing of the night, someone just starts yelling, and we couldn't hear what they were saying, but they were just yelling and yelling and yelling, and it went on for like seemed interminable, but probably a minute of just rah 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 rah. And Tom said, why don't you just get up here? Why don't you come up here? Instead of standing down there like a coward, why don't you get up on stage and tell us how you really feel? And then the person started yelling, blah, blah, blah. And Tom was like, righto, see you later, put his guitar down and just walked off.
Oh.
Um, well, presumably this person was ejected. Again, we couldn't see down into where all this was going on. Um,
Well, either he was the prophet of a new world, or that's just that
I mean,
principle of anarchy.
well,
Uh,
I looked it up I looked up what it was about. It was about Gaza, and
uh, uh, uh,
Radiohead have played in Israel, not since 2017, but a number of times, and this person
okay.
obviously felt very justified in trying to call Tom out on that. But he did eventually come back out and played Karma Police, which, shock horror, is my least favorite song from OK Computer, and one of the most annoying songs that Radiohead ever made. I absolutely love that album. But anyway, he finished with that, and it kind of seemed somewhat appropriate after that. But yeah, it was marred by that. But anyway, great gig, just a late night, and then of course one's toddler doesn't have the response. Oh, mum and dad have been out late, so they need to sleep in. It's more, I didn't see mum and dad much last night, so as soon as I wake up at 6 in the morning, I'm going to rush into their bedroom and wake them up. So anyway, um, but all good. So yeah, back to the
All
topic at
right. Now that you got your excuse for not being as precise and coherent as you'd
hand.
like, go ahead.
So pathetic, isn't it? Yeah, but I do have this disturbing blankness in my mind at the moment. But yeah, why has the trend of evolution been upwards? Um, blah blah blah. Um, in the lapse of organic species, a lapse of time, organic species of higher and higher types have evolved and are not in the least explained. This is the second time in this paragraph he said not in the least explained. Again, it depends on what we mean by explanation, perhaps. Um, could we say maybe accounted for or made possible by? So the survival, and I mean he again, you could argue that he says that. Of course, they're all in conformity with this constraint, but not in the least explained by any doctrine of adaptation to the environment or of struggle. In fact, the upward trend has often been accompanied by a growth of the converse relation. Animals have progressively undertaken the task of adapting the environment to themselves. Okay, so he's absolutely right that, of course, niche construction is a massive deal. Um, by adapting the environment to themselves, um, the organisms are, of course, changing the environment not just for themselves, but of any other organism that lives in that environment. So that becomes, in the selectionist terms, yet another selection pressure. So that's not a converse trend from survival. Organisms adapt to the environment in order to make it better for their own survival and their own lineages in a certain sense. And then that creates a selection pressure on other organisms to adapt to that novel environment. And lest we forget, the environment for any organism is not the like inorganic components of its context. It is predominantly the other organisms. Again, not just the niche construction that those organisms do, but the actual living, moving, etc., organic competing, cooperating, etc., organisms themselves, right? So whilst it, on the one hand, opens up a select, creates a selection pressure when when any given organism changes the environment, other organisms have to adapt to that change. It also opens up new niche space, right? So it is intrinsically a complexification of the environment when you differentiate it for your own purposes. So niche construction is both exerting a selection pressure on organisms, but as the corollary of that is opening up new niche space for other organisms to spread into. So again, this outwards thing that I was talking about is more of a spreading, right, than an upwards, or it's not the antithesis of inwardness. It's a spreading into the novel space. And so one way of saying this is to say, and this is very much not the point that I want to get to, but there was nowhere else to go. If you want to talk about upwards or complexification, the very simple spaces, like the space of pure conformity, well, that's been occupied since, I don't know, quite shortly after the Big Bang, when, say, the Standard Model coalesced as a particular constraint, as a particular grounding environmental context. So at the level at which the niche partitioning that the Standard Model itself represents, with all of its different particles and forces, each having a different complementary role, defining a certain space, a certain arena, the degrees of freedom are all full at that level already, right? So given that there's still, because we're not determinists, given that there's still, though, well, we'd have to get into the virtual and the actual, etc., to fully cash this out in terms of speculative metaphysics, but I don't want to go there right now. But given that there's still ongoing change, but the degrees of freedom at a certain level are fully occupied, then there has to be a spreading, there has to be a generation of novel spaces, like what Levin and Fields would call arbitrary spaces, so to speak, but basically novel axes or novel dimensions of change have to be pursued and occupied. So what happens with niche construction, though, is that as novel spaces are opened, you get this escape and radiate kind of dynamic. Whilst niche space gets occupied right here, the fact of construction of novel differentiations of the environment, again, is creating novel niches for things to spread into and to escape the competitive exclusion that they experience in the particular niche, right? So a way of surviving, again, totally accountable for or in conformity with survival of the fittest, is to not try to exploit the same space, the same resources that are already overexploited. So if new space is being made available by some process, spreading into that space is a very standard evolutionary dynamic that we call,
So the question I would have there is this just a pressure from behind that kind of pushes organisms out of already inhabited niches into as yet uninhabited niches, or is there some level of organismic decision in addition to environmental selection that's going on here? Because that's what Whitehead's argument here is that the role of organismic decision, the decisions of organisms, is being left out here. The role of the aim at living better, in other words. And he has this whole interesting connection that he draws, and this is page 14, where he talks about, first it starts as a discussion about method. What is method? Methodology. And he says methodologies have their own life history, right? And he thinks that they're born out of some dodge facilitating the accomplishment of a nascent urge of life, right? And then in the next paragraph, all of a sudden he's talking about species of organism as themselves an example of established methods. And he says that, he says, when any methodology of life has exhausted the novelties within its scope and played upon them up to the incoming of fatigue, one final decision determines the fate of a species. It can stabilize itself and relapse so as to live, or it can shake itself free and enter upon the adventure of living better. In the latter event, the species seizes upon one of the nascent methodologies concealed in the welter of miscellaneous experience beyond the scope of the old dominant way. If the choice be happy, evolution has taken what he calls an upward trend. If unhappy, the oblivion of time covers the vestiges of a vanished race. So, is there a role in your account for, I mean, what I hear you doing is trying to describe this process of evolution in such a way that it avoids, first of all, the implications of upward, but also any role for aim in individual organisms in making
No,
a
no, no, no,
decision
no, no.
to,
It's
to
just
seek to seek greater forms of satisfaction in particular.
I would say that as an obvious, phenomenological fact or empirical fact of human life, organisms do that. That we seek satisfaction.
Right, right. So humans have foresight, and where does that capacity for foresight come from? Is it
Yeah.
something that's intrinsic to life? And if not, when did it come online and how?
Well, so the question here is again about what is fundamental, right? So if we're taking something like survival of the fittest to be fundamental in this domain, to define essentially, it's the fundamental tautology that defines a space of reasons. If we're taking it to be that, then the question is whether what it can account for, and whether we need something equally fundamental like the aim of organisms. It is absolutely clear that organisms have aims, but whether that is equally fundamental, I mean, you could obviously say that survival of the fittest is an aim in itself.
Survival is an aim. Yeah.
Um, but the way that he frames it there in terms of wanting to live better or to pursue novelty, again, the pursuit of novelty. I mean, I just went to a gig last night and I was thinking a lot in, Tom York covering all these different stylistic all these different genres. I was thinking about the gluttony of creativity, basically, and how, you know, really hyper creative people are basically addicts. And there's, a whole conversation to have about the connection between, actual addiction to exogenous substances and things and creativity, etc. We don't need to, to hash that out right now either. But addicted to novelty, addicted to essentially, surprising themselves, turning themselves on, doing something that hasn't been done before, either by them or perhaps, uh, so far as it's possible to see from their frame of reference, by anybody. And the corollary of that is that this hyper creativity is not really just something, I mean, perhaps it isn't fully, equally distributed amongst all people, or certainly amongst all organisms, but it's also not something that only exists in those people who are able to, that find a way in their particular context to, in fact, express that. A Tom York, for example. A lot of people are hyper creative and unable to find a way to, you know, get the rubber to hit the road with that creative impulse, that creative drive in the particular life context in which they find themselves or which they have manufactured for themselves. We talk about getting out of our own way and all of that sort of thing. And this drive that is in such people is positively debilitating and it kind of eats you alive if you don't express it in some way. So yes, of course, all of that exists in organisms, exists in humans, and Whitehead often wants to generalize from something that he's observing in his experience and the experience of other humans to the cosmos as a whole. And that's his principle of reverse generalization, right? But is that a coordinate power? Is that as fundamental as what I'm getting at here? Okay, so what am I getting at here? If any given system that starts out arbitrarily simple, right, given a very simple environment and exploiting, some particular resource, and imagine a very, very simple agent-based model. There's a simple resource. There are a few degrees of freedom. There are no competitors. That organism will stay certain principles like Jane's principle of maximum entropy will predict that that organism will stay as simple as it possibly can, whilst there is no competition, whilst there is no threat to its survival. So whilst that, let's say, highly specialized in this context, whilst that old way of doing things, that established way of doing things, as Whitehead is referring to it, whilst that works, there's no impetus to do anything different. And so that system will not change. Um, that would be the argument, right? Um, so you're as simple as possible given the range of variables that you need to be responsive to. But the corollary of this Jane's principle of maximum entropy is Ashby's law of requisite variation. So you have to be complex or versatile enough. You have to have enough degrees of freedom to deal with the complexity of any other system that you're wanting to control or regulate or essentially adapt to. So when you have multiple agents in an environment and say they are competing for a single resource, um, this drives complexity because now the competing agent is part of the environment. So we've gone from a simple environment with just one agent with one strategy. Now we have two agents, but exploiting a similar resource that are competing with each other. The existence of the additional agent is a complexification of the environment, obviously, and it will drive the complexity of our original agent because it now has to deal with both finding that resource, but also, getting there faster or somehow getting more of it than the other agents, or somehow getting enough of it. They don't necessarily need to get more of it, but here we end up with this story of the trees kind of situation, right, where forests are partly in existence because of a competition amongst plants to reach the sunlight. And so we have these incredibly complex ecosystems. But think about all the differentiation that happens because forests exist. I don't want to reduce forests, like explain forests away by saying, well, it's just a competition for sunlight. But that is a grounding principle, a very basic explanation. It doesn't explain all of what's going on in a forest, but it begins to account for why there is a forest in the first instance. And then that forest.
Right. As does the cooperative or symbiotic relationship of fungi and root systems of plants that allow them to even break down the nutrients in the soil, right? So we don't want to overplay the competitive side or the cooperative symbiotic side. Like all of these are factors. And so they're all at
These
the
are
base level of the explanation of why there are forests, right?
Yes, but they're all just about surviving at a slightly more base level, right? So
Hmm.
cooperating. So one way of dealing with the threat of competition is to join forces in a certain sense, right? One way of dealing with a complexity in your environment is to make some of it you basically is to enter into symbiotic relationships to become some kind of that's one major pathway of complexification, obviously. And that again, that complexification, which could be driven by symbiosis, can be driven by lots of different things, is itself driven by the complexification of the environment. So we have principles like the Red Queen hypothesis, right, in evolutionary biology, where it's like running on the spot just to keep up. And of course, these things often are framed, and even I was doing it then, but I was just giving a small example about the forest. But in terms of competition, so when we think about the Red Queen, we're often thinking about like predator prey arms race or parasite host arms race or something like that, and so just to stay viable, you have to be, you're in this constant competition. I mean, there are lots of great examples from toxin evolution, which render that very vivid. But of course, it can be extended to cooperation. You are complexifying just your own lineage. Well, one way of complexifying also is to incorporate other lineages into your own functional or structural lineage, even if you're still separate genetically. And of course, we know that that's also not always the case because horizontal gene transfer, etc. But even if you were still completely separate genetically, incorporating additional lineages functionally is just another way of complexifying. But the whole thing is atop of this so-called zero force evolutionary law or Heraclitean fire or whatever, the basic principle of churning, roiling change, which is what is not So when again Whitehead's talking about the art of persistence is to be dead, this doesn't really account for the fact of, and I know, of course, Whitehead is very aware of this,
Mhm.
of constant change. So weathering even for a rock or something like that, you know. So again, how would we define the rock? Is it the
Just
whole Pilbara block that we're talking about? Because you have to go to something like the whole Pilbara block to find a rock that is older than a living lineage.
just so we're clear on Whitehead's account of change, though, it's not as I meant I didn't get a chance to interrupt earlier when you characterized change as with this phrase like it moves. Um, that's sort of like that's Aristotle's account of like what is time, what is change. It's the movement of things. Whitehead would say that change has nothing to do the change he is pointing to with a term like creativity has nothing to do with movement. It has to do with uh, the process of actualization, the movement from possible to actual, which is not about the movement of a body in space. Um, right? It's about the realization of possibilities. And so creativity is Whitehead pointing to the way in which novelty can ingress into a situation rather than pointing to the way that already existing things can get rearranged in an already existing space, right? And so that's when we think of change, we tend to think of it, you know, things in space time moving around, but that's
Yeah.
not the deeper metaphysical sense of creative advance that Whitehead would be pointing to.
Well, yeah, that's really good. A really important thing to point out. I mean, I was using a spatial metaphor when I'm saying it moves, but when I was speaking about the creation of discovery, creation, and exploitation of additional degrees of freedom,
Yeah.
I'm not talking about movement in physical space. I
Right.
specifically reference like,
But a Dawkinsian, you know, genetic reductionist would say, "Oh, you mean a mutation in of DNA molecules? That's what changes biologically speaking."
well, that is one of the many layers at
Mhm.
which we can talk about the existence of some kind of arbitrary or stochastic principle of change
Yeah.
that is continually opening up new spaces. And, you know, he talked in that section that you read, you know, Whitehead talks nicely about what would be referred to as co-option or really exaptation, in terms of exploiting the novelty that has already been accumulated in the process of evolution. Again, you read it, and I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says that one might do that, and that might open up, you know, this creative passage into some novel state, or one might consolidate and so merely survive. But that I'd say is again not exactly correct in the sense that consolidating might entail not surviving. That would be not adapting, in fact. So he says adaptation cannot account for these things. Well, adaptation is specifically about um, there being this layer of uncanalized change that has accumulated that is then elicited by a particular environmental context, such that the phenotype, ultimately the organism itself, can adopt some novel arrangement, which is now adaptive for the slightly new context. It's not about just like you're only consolidating and continuing to do the same thing if it's working. You know, that only equates to survival if it's working. You know, like if you've got a very robust modus operandi, or there's very little competition in the niche space that you have occupied, and you know, so one response there, which you know aligns with what Whitehead is saying, is specialization. So move into a niche space which is basically unoccupied because very challenging to survive in, and then consolidate. It's challenging basically because you have to become very specialized, very adapted to that particular niche space, and consolidate. But when and if that niche becomes no longer available, when the eucalyptus trees go extinct, the koalas are not going to, you know, consolidate and survive. They're either going to exploit a novel source, or their specialization trajectory is going to have run its course and they're going to go extinct. So I
Yeah.
think
As you put it, the oblivion of time covers the vestiges of a vanished race. I mean, if either if the choice is not made to to consider the adventure of living better, um, and one resorts to maintaining an existing method that has been working in a past environment that's no longer there. I mean, you could either continue persisting for some time and then go extinct, or you could make the risk of, ingressing some novelty, and go on that adventure and find out that, well, actually, there's no niche there, and you could also go extinct, right? So either way, the risk
Yeah.
is, but
But this will not necessarily require a choice, you know? It might, I mean, depending on what you mean by a choice, like a choice by the whole organism. Often, so not a
emphasis on novelty.
yeah.
What
So
is,
when we speak about foresight, though, one of the kinds of foresight that an organism might have, this is not cognitive, this is not necessarily experienced phenomenologically, as prediction of some kind. This is not a Popperian creature necessarily, as Dennett would say, but is the basically the exploitation, the development of a strategy that enables the accumulation of essentially uncanalized change. So you can look at genetic redundancy, for example.
Mhm.
You can look at gene expression fluctuating within certain margins. And one strategy that basically the strategy of evolvability or plasticity is to have a bunch of accumulated neutral change, which then one doesn't make like, again, how do we define a choice? It's not that there's a choice to start exploiting that, it's that the environment elicits the exploitation of that. So, as we've talked about before, but again, it's another thorny issue. The environment starts to seem more like the agent in that case, because the environment is changing, and that's, of course, other organisms largely, unless it's, a meteorite or a volcano, like some inorganic process of environmental change. And of course, those have had a huge impact on evolutionary trajectories and survivability as well. But it's often other organisms that are changing the environment, up to and including humans with niche construction
Yeah.
as our niche, changing the environment, changing the selection pressures, changing the adaptive requirements for everything else. But that change of the environment, which is comprised largely of other organisms, then elicits the co-option, the exaptation of that, of either a novel of a pre-existing trait that had some other function, but it turns out can be redeployed in some other way, or some arbitrary thing, which again would be inexplicable in itself, right? So no complete explanations here. We've got to get back to the 047 illusionary law thing in a second. Drift broadly speaking, but again, it's the principle that corresponds to the principle of firstness first. The principle of not it moves spatially, but it changes if you
Isn't that
want.
a Galileo thing? I mean, that term, I don't know where, yeah.
What he says that, and nonetheless it moves, and still it moves, or whatever, right? He whispers that as he's going, yeah, for sure. But again, there's this accumulation of arbitrary differentiation, basically, the stochastic element, which again can be experiential, can be directly exploited. Some organisms, I'm trying to avoid saying higher organisms,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So this exaptation principle, like what was a swim bladder could become a lung when the environment changes. But why did the environment change? Because that fish
Other,
decided to start going up onto the land and then all of a sudden discovered it could breathe, right? Um,
yeah, yeah, but partly because their niche space, not there was open niche space on
yeah,
land,
yeah.
basically.
I
You know,
think Whitehead's concern is just that I mean, first of all, organism and environment, we can easily fall into the habit of imagining that these are actually separate factors, when life itself seems to have emerged precisely at the interface, um, between environments. It's a kind of edge effect between gradients, chemical, thermodynamic, etc. But he wants to resist this idea that organisms are just passively awaiting the judgment of environments. No question, sometimes a meteorite impact occurs and the environment has judged that any species larger than a shrew is going to go extinct. But the history of life, as he says, is the history of life adapting the environment to itself. And the only reason life has persisted to the point that it has is because it's adapted the environment so much so that the very temperature of the planet is being self-regulated, right?
Yeah, for sure. But it's the reciprocal adaptation. It's not like the history of life is not life adapting the environment to itself as a one-way thing. And again, the environment is life
Mhm.
after a very early point. As you're saying, I mean, after the cyanobacteria kills everything else by accidentally not adapting the environment to itself so far as we know, just producing a waste product, oxygen, and completely changing the atmosphere and causing the great oxygen catastrophe, like the
Mhm.
first mass extinction that we know of, which is never in the list for some reason of mass extinctions.
Yeah.
When after that happens, seemingly arbitrarily, so far as we know, the environment henceforth is life, essentially, right? Is a biosphere. Um, and
Yeah.
so, yeah. So, of course, that's 100% right. Whitehead's very right about that. What I'm trying to get at here is his claim that this process is not in the least explained. Again, what does explain mean? But accounted for by a principle of survival, and even the choice that the Tiktaalik, and I mean, there's a long series of choices preserved in the fossil record of lineage choices. Um, of moving into the shallow water, walking along the bottom, lobe-finned fish, eventually, so there's a very gradual thing going on here, eventually spending more time like a mud skipper, in this liminal, littoral, littoral zone, the interstitial zone, I mean, to your point, but the interstitial zone between the aquatic and land, because there are less predators there. There are other things that have already done that, like invertebrates of all sorts have already colonized that environment. So there's tons of food there. So there's not much competition. If you're like a large vertebrate fish, you can avoid your predators and exploit relatively underexploited food sources by spreading outwards. It might seem like literally upwards because you're going from sea level to, but you're spreading outwards into available niche space, basically. So again, the picture that I'm trying to articulate very, very poorly, and I apologize for that, is that if we take as our grounding principle change, creativity, as Whitehead does, but so if we're in the Heraclitean lineage in that sense, and then our second principle essentially is the formation of habits of some kind. So there are ways in which we get you know canalizing ordered structures. So you can call it the primordial nature of God if you want, but this is a process that starts, right? Creating a particular arena. So we talked about something like the standard model in this sense. But if we just generalize that, that's selection, right? So you've got firstness and you've got the production of environments. Environments are selection in the sense that they're simultaneously a novel environment is space to move into and something that you will have to be in accordance with if you are going to move into it. So the contextual definition of your fitness will change. A mud skipper or Tiktaalik or like some early um, amphibian, its fitness is very different in the littoral zone, or in fact, moving further onto land than it would be if it remained in the aquatic environment, obviously, right? So simultaneously, it's space to enter into and space that one is then by virtue of having moved into it, forced to adapt to. Adaptation based on whatever resources you have, which again he gestures toward, Whitehead gestures towards, will be elicited, or you will not survive, and that's what elicits the adaptation, is the principle of surviving in that sense. But so if we take change as our first principle, we can say differentiation is going to happen. That's what change is. And differentiation is going to be basically complexification, because it's differentiation of the environment. And in order to be able to exploit, or I mean, these terms exploit and everything, in order to be able to live in a diverse environment, you yourself need to be slightly more diverse. That's just Ashby's law of requisite variation. You need to be, if your environment is only composed of type A things, then you only need to be responsive to type A things. But if you live in a niche which contains type A and type B things, you yourself will have to become reciprocally more complex, because you have to deal with the challenges or the affordances, positive and negative affordances, of both A and B, to the extent that you live across that slightly more differentiated niche. But so if differentiation is a given, which it is in this worldview, it is in Whitehead's cosmology, it is in our view, then everything else sort of arises from that. To the extent that any system becomes more complex, any system that needs to respond to that system, that is in relation to that system, or like wishes to control or exploit it, or even cooperate with it, as a kind of form of exploitation, although that's a nasty way of putting it, will necessarily itself have to become complex. So
So what's becoming complex is then not just the organisms, but the environments, right?
yes.
And I think the organism environment field, and that's the where Whitehead will go in processing reality, is what's complexifying. And so rather than thinking of there's life over here and then there's the environment over there, which is, I don't know, physics and chemistry or whatever, or Darwin's construal of the evolutionary process occurring biologically with the fixed law of gravitation in the background. I think in the more organismic paradigm we're aiming for, and the more general account of evolution we're aiming for, there's no organism and environment as these separate domains. And so I think, when we talk about complexification, it's easy to mistake Whitehead's argument as if he's just saying that organisms as these sort of skin-bounded systems or something is what's becoming more complex. He's saying the whole environment, if you want, is becoming complex, if we want to frame it that way, or better, the organism environment field.
But I think he's not quite saying that here. I think you're right. That's the trend of his thought. But I
Mhm.
think if you look at what he's saying, like here on just on page 4, he is not quite saying that. He really is seeming to separate these two things.
He talks
And
about the attack on the environment, which is one of my least favorite
yeah, yeah.
lines. I don't know if
Um,
that's on that page, but
I think it
uh,
is, or it's around there somewhere anyway. Um, Yeah, and I think it's because he's trying to say that this survival of the fittest isn't enough, I guess, that he's led to saying these sorts of things. And I do think he hasn't fully, at least in the way he's expressing himself here. And look, it's challenging, and I like this book. He hasn't fully incorporated exactly the idea that you and I mean, obviously we're in fierce agreement about what you're saying. I'm saying the environment is mostly comprised of other organisms, and so it's just differentiation as a fundamental principle is going to drive complexity through the mechanism of essentially survival of the fittest, or things that are good at persisting tend to persist. Um,
mhm.
just to put it into kind of, quote unquote prebiotic context, we also know in systems chemistry that a hypercycle, a catalytic network, can exploit a substrate more effectively than a single catalytic cycle. So complexification can be driven simply by competition in that prebiotic context. If these systems are competing, if you've got two systems competing for a single resource, you can show in a principled way, both in simulations but also in actual systems, that a more complex system will be able to do that by basically undergoing internal differentiation. So complexity is about internal differentiation. It's actually about niche partitioning, or Well, a colonial organism, or like an ant colony has internal niche partitioning. There are castes with different functional roles within the superorganism. Obviously, a multicellular organism, a complex organism, has that internal differentiation, which is I mean, is it the analog? It's certainly the operational analog, but it's basically the homolog of external differentiation, right? Especially in this Ashbean sense, because the organism can do more things because it has different subsystems which are specialized to more things. But so if you get that complexification, even at the prebiotic level in systems chemistry, and again, what do we want by prebiotic here? And of course, we both want to generalize this, vitalist animist thing, view, which we think is the thrust of Whitehead's thought as well. The other
Mhm.
thinkers who we like in different ways, and obviously I think you think Whitehead is the the apex of this kind of thinking. I'm less convinced of that, but basically, it a
Mm.
network, a catalytic network, has then internal differentiation because it's got two different, or more than two different cycles, which are each now able to specialize for particular tasks, and it's competing with a less complex system which can't do that kind of internal niche partitioning and specialization of different tasks. So it's kind of generalized, but not as good. It's a jack of all trades.
Mhm.
It's going to get out competed. And so even at the most basic level of systems that you can think of that are life adjacent, but I think again we can tell this story going all the way back to fundamental physics. And I think something like, again, the free energy principle allows us to reach all the way down in this sense to the inactivist physics, as we've discussed, and don't have time to unpack that today. But
Yeah.
this principle that complexity, um, enables you, Ashby's law of requisite variation, to bring more of the environment under your purview, or to more effectively exploit even a simple thing in the environment, as with these catalytic networks. You know, again, you can reduce that as again a fundamental tautology, not as a complete explanation, not as trying to reduce the fact that Tom York is wildly creative to some, like, to survival of the fittest. Even though obviously we can joke about the way rock stars can have lots of gametes and into the next generation we can blah blah blah, but obviously we know as a matter of personal experience that that is not the only reason to be into novelty. And again, we've got explore exploit to talk about here. We've got path dependency, expected free energy versus variational free energy. Like, there are lots of principled accounts to which Whitehead didn't have the same kind of access to that we have, that we can use to go, okay, on top of this fundamental tautology, or like the free energy principle as a constructive principle of least action is a fundamental tautology. That which persists, or that which is good at persisting, persists. These are fundamental tautologies, and on the basis of that, we can layer up principles that enable us to account for the origins of complexity without, again, making fundamental, um, a drive towards complexity, right? Without making fundamental, similarly fundamental. If that's not impoverished enough, is kind of my point going way back to the beginning. And again, we can debate whether in this text versus in Whitehead's broader corpus, he is trying to make that principle fundamental. I think there's something in his thought which just rubs me slightly the wrong way, which is in fact the vestiges of the Victorian progressivism of a certain kind. He has, in just like I don't like in Peirce, his insistence that for evolutionary realism you need to have these two, real but inexistent,
Yeah.
start and end point. Um, Whitehead has something similar with the primordial and the consequent, um,
Yeah.
and
They're
that
both mathematicians and they're both trying to find some compromise third position that's not epigenesis, that's not preformationism, but does justice to these two core intuitions that, there's this principle of order and then there's this principle of anarchy, and neither on their own are adequate. right? And so I think they're both recognizing that. We only have a few more minutes. I have to run in 6 minutes. Um, I wanted to just throw in to this what Whitehead says about cycles, because
Oh
in
yeah.
some sense, I think it's the most generative part of this whole book. And I this is what clued me in when I started hanging out with Bruce Damer and learning about he and David Deemer's theory of the origin of life through these cycles of dehydration and rehydration in freshwater ponds. What Whitehead says about cycles, I think, speaks precisely to um, this question of finding the right balance between order and anarchy, or between the epigenesis view and the preformationist view, where he says, I mean, this is, and he gets into cycles in the context of these three different forms of canalization or stabilization: the way of blindness, which would just be blind repetition, which is what most of the non-biological physical world is doing, and then the way of rhythm, which and these aren't mutually exclusive, he's careful to say, the way of rhythm and then the way of transience. The way of rhythm is, I think, the core for Whitehead. And he says that it pervades all of life and indeed all physical existence. So even though there's a lot of mere repetition going on in the physical, inorganic world, there's this rhythm to it. And he thinks that rhythm is the closest he can get to a sort of definition of what life is. Um, and that the root principle of life, he says, is in some lowly form exemplified in all types of physical existence, like electromagnetic vibration is an example of rhythm, right? But he talks about rhythm in terms of a round of experiences, and this is where cycles come in. And he says that this is page 17. The cycle is such that its own completion provides the conditions for its own mere repetition. So there's something tautological going on there. It eliminates the fatigue attendant upon the repetition of any one of its parts, um, which means that there's a difference. He wants to distinguish between um, the abstract structure of the cycle and the variation of the concrete details of succeeding cycles. So that in any rhythm, there's not just complete repetition. That would be the way of blindness. There's a principle of variation, right? And he says that the cycle element is driven into the foundation, and
Mm-hmm.
variations of cycles and of cycles are elaborated. And so to the very base of existence is this cycling process, which is kind of spiralic because it's never the same twice. But when we think about what he might mean by something like the primordial nature of God, I think we need to read that more preformationist idea in concert with with what he's saying right here. The cycle element is driven into the foundation, which is to say that there's not really a foundation. The further back we go, we're just going to see more um repetitions with a difference, in like Deleuze's sense of difference in repetition. Um and
But
so
it's a ramification in the sense that there are, like, I've thought about this in a musical metaphor in terms of, I don't like infinite, but infinite subdivisions of the cosmic beat, so to speak. There's one
mm,
rhythm that everything is in conformity with, the attractor, which is a
mhm,
dynamic conception of the primordial nature.
right.
And then but you can infinitely basically subdivide a beat, right? You can always split a beat into, other subdivisions, and I mean, there's lots of musical juiciness we could talk about there, but yeah. No, I like that image a lot that he gives there. Yeah.
Yeah, and um that this cycling and this way of rhythm, I think, is precisely where a general theory of evolution can come in, which is what I think Whitehead's trying to describe with his process of what he calls concrescence, where there is both a principle in concrescence, a principle of inheritance, a principle of variation, and a principle of selection, right? All just implicit in this idea of concrescence, which is itself again a cycle. And life, if we're going to understand how life originated, I think one of the ways we can approach that to make it more tractable is to imagine life as, in order to reach that bare minimum sort of lowest common denominator of survival, it needs to internalize the rhythms of its cosmic environment. And so, 5 or 4.5 billion years ago, when liquid water first forms on the Earth, maybe 4.5, 4.3, 4.2, whatever it was, for life to emerge, it's made possible by the fact that the Earth is spinning and you get the day-night cycle, and the moon is orbiting and you get the tidal cycles, and you get these subtler cycles of, the if the hot spring hypothesis is right and not the deep sea hydrothermal thesis, but either way, life is having to find a way to internalize all of these rhythms, and in some ways to become not autonomous from its environment, but to become a microcosm, right? To internalize those rhythms so that what was just happening in the environment, these various cycles, becomes a metabolic cycle that allows this form to maintain itself. And as soon as it maintains itself, it's then changing the environment that it had to internalize before, right? And so, yeah, I think there's a something that remains deeply relevant in what White is saying about cycles here. That it's still relevant for thinking with, and I think the idea that no cycle is a mere repetition of the past allows us to understand not just change, but what he wants to call aim, which we don't need to think of in some magical, impossible to understand scientifically sort of way, but rather as just that, not just the ingression of novelty, but the ability to emphasize certain novelties, certain possibilities over others. Because he's trying to balance efficient causation and final causation. He's trying to understand evolution not just as a push from behind, but that there's also this other factor, which is the lure from ahead. And we don't want to end up in a situation metaphysically where we have to understand these two forces as in conflict with each other, as if they're just two principles at war with each other. I think you kind of get that in Bergson, who's more comfortable with these dualisms, whereas I feel Whitehead always trying to arrive at contrasts and not conflicts between these ideas. And so again, concrescence seems to me to be his attempt to account both for that push from behind, physical feelings, as well as the pull from the future, foresight, which combines in every cycle, right? There's an integration of these two influences in every cycle. I think is, the best I can articulate what I feel is important about his concept of cycle in this text. Did I lose you for a second? I think your connection has gone bad.
Yeah, connection's just gone a bit funny. Yeah, I really appreciate all of that. I mean, there are so many resonances there, and I know you've got to go, but even Dennett actually comes to mind in terms of his discussion of cycles within cycles. So that's something that he was very big on. My notes on this page say autocatalysis up the top, of course.
Or
Where it gets,
thermodynamic work cycles from
yeah,
Kaufman as well.
yeah, where it gets to the music thing, I've got rondo, passacaglia, and of course jazz. But particularly passacaglia would be a really interesting form to explore there, because that's a cyclic progression with variations. on top. But of course, the jazz, this is actually one of the things that Adorno would bash about jazz. But jazz is very often, you speak of a jazz standard with choruses on which people improvise, is the repetition of a cycle of harmony that people then play variations over. But the cycle element being driven into the foundation, I've got written unconscious complexes there. So there's an interesting connection there. A complex is a cycle. It's a kind of little dissipative structure in the psyche, but that gets driven into the unconscious and continues to animate, continues to basically set the degrees of freedom of the quote unquote higher order conscious processes, but without necessarily being observed. But of course, internalizing the cycles and the rhythmic articulation of it is beautiful and very, very useful, is also what in the free energy principle literature would be called acquiring the sufficient statistics of the embedding environment. And then when you turn that into a constructive principle, which is fully licensed by the principle itself and its connection to non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, so what I call constructive coarse graining, it's it's the creation of the cycles of the environment, and their basically, as you say, the microcosmic element, but with its feedback on the environment in this kind of active inference sense. And you can tell a very rich story about that in terms of things that even literally look like macroscopic cycles like Bénard cells and things like that. So emergent dissipative structures. Uh,
Right.
and yeah, I think all those things come together really beautifully.
And the last thing, and then I got to run, that I wanted to mention earlier about Karl Popper. I
Uh,
think, I mean, I know he read some Whitehead,
mm,
but whether or not Popper was influenced directly or this is just a neat correspondence, the distinction Popper makes between the context of discovery and the context of justification, I think maps pretty well. And Whitehead even uses the phrase uh, context of discovery or logic of discovery in this text, I think. It maps pretty well to his distinction between speculative reason and practical reason, where practical reason gets locked into a method of justification, or whereby one could justify a scientific fact or principle and or proposition, and the logic of discovery, where imagination and creativity and all these things that can't be methodologically worked out or programmed become a factor. And
This is Peirce as well. This is very
right,
Peircean.
sure, sure, sure,
Induction and deduction. So the derivation, the discovery, but the construction of a novel frame of reference, and then the exploration, the uncovering, the articulation, the revealing of the degrees of freedom within that frame of reference, right? And so then you bring in the Kuhnian thing as well, the
yeah,
paradigm shift being the shift from
right,
one
yeah,
ground of reference to another, and normal science versus blah blah blah, paradigmatic shift.
revolutionary, yeah, awesome. Well, I think we got through the first like 18 pages of this book at least. So,
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I don't think I was on good form today, but I think yeah, we got through some of the stuff. Um, Again, I think it's a wonderful text. I think there are just a couple of things that he says, and just an overall emphasis that I think we can and should probably update, insert into the contemporary discourse. And some of that will be showing that, for me anyway, that there's actually more juice in some of these principles. They don't need to be treated reductionistically in the sort of eliminative sense. This is not about explaining things away. And
mhm.
his arguments against reductionism in here are very, apt and important as well. But there's actually more juice in some of the principles, well, particularly survival of the fittest. Again, I don't love that phrase, but it's about an operation. It's not about the coinage specifically. There's more juice in that than I think Whitehead actually gives credit here. Um,
Fair enough. All right. Well,
Obviously,
I mean,
you're not convinced, but uh,
um,
let's say,
I think what I'm convinced of is that there's some residues of Victorian, so the idea of endless progress. But even so, while Whitehead can use this archaic terminology, I think there are counter uh, tendencies in his work that mitigate against that to some extent. But I'm not so interested in defending Whitehead as I am in seeing what principles are still alive here. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think it's got plenty of juice in that regard. And to be honest, I think it's generative, and it would be generative, as I said, in a sort of postgrad seminar context, in terms of the things that it slightly gets, in my view, slightly wrong in terms of a matter of emphasis, basically. So that's actually it's generative as it's dated to a certain degree, and to the extent that he's trying to be a thinker of his time, he can't avoid being dated. But some of the principles that he articulates, obviously here, but also in his work as a whole, are much less dated than a couple of the critical remarks that he makes here. But
Yeah.
yeah, if we change survival of the fittest to that which is good at persisting persists and treat it as a grounding tautology that affords the possibility of explanation, not itself an explanation of any given particular, I think that actually changes things quite significantly. And that's consistent with what Whitehead is saying, but
Yeah,
he
I just think unless we're going to say that, unless we come up with a way of also including aim, we're not going to have an explanation. Because his whole point about this analogy, why we always try to explain the more complex forms of life by reference to the lower forms of life, why not reverse the analogy? If human beings are purposeful agents capable of science and art and technology and so on, um, we need to account for where that comes from. And so why not reverse the analogy? And unless aim gets inserted at some point along the way by some mysterious magical process, I think we're left having to, if we want an explanation, to source it much earlier in the process, if not part of the origins of the universe as such.
can't we say, at least at this level, and I do think we would get to the origins of the cosmic epoch as such.
Mhm.
Uh, the origins of everything, I don't think, are within any remit necessarily. But again, we speak cosmogenesis, we can think about it in terms of basic principles. But isn't survival, and again, that's not necessarily the word we want to use because that is a generalization from biology.
I mean,
But
hydrogen atoms do really well at persistence.
sure, sure. So they survive. Yeah. In this sense. So if we're generalizing, and what's the
Mhm.
like I said, I don't like the term survival of the fittest. I don't like that. If it's that which is good at persisting persists, then there's already an implicit aim in that. It's already taken for granted in some sense, and maybe that needs to be critiqued, but that persistence is good. But actually, there's a way of getting around that, I think, because persistence is it's just what happens when things persist or they don't persist. But there's an incipient aim there. So we don't actually need aim to appear magically. We need aims to be differentiated on the basis of this very tautological aim, incipient aim or proto aim or whatever, of persistence. And of course, we know in terms of directionality, if that's aim, we know we can account for that, the emergence of that as well. Um,
With introducing some other unexplained explainers, but yeah.
well, I don't know. I think we could explain, like we can frame all of thermodynamics, for example, in terms of exactly these principles. So we can do the Peircean evolutionary triad treatment for thermodynamics and talk about directionality in that context as well. Directionality emerges when you have arbitrary change that becomes canalized somehow. Canals are directional.
Mhm.
Um, so
Well, I just mean unexplained explainer, like cosmologically speaking, we need to posit a very low entropy state at the beginning of things to understand the running down from that point.
if that were that's not the model that I'm referring. That's a closed systems, steam engine take on thermodynamics. That's a
Which
pre-non-equilibrium
is the
mechanics.
Big Bang cosmological model, which is the dominant framework that's
I
in
agree.
vogue
I
right
agree.
now. So.
I agree. But that's not the framework that you and I are.
Right. So a lot of our discussions, I feel like we're in agreement, and I'm um, pushing back against the popular modes of thought that you don't indulge in. Um, and that I still feel because they're so popular, it's important to sort of,
I
pull the rug out a little bit here and there.
I don't disagree with that. I think then I take the contrary, slightly contrary stance of let's not throw babies out with the bathwater. Let's separate the principle itself from the popular or even, dominant, speculative, as we talked about, presuppositions of the science that's making use of these principles. But I'm
Right.
giving I'm still a sort of structural realist in terms of the principles themselves. It's the interpretation. It's actually not the principles so much as the philosophical gloss, the interpretation of the principle that is going astray in a lot of
Yeah.
these.
It's philosophy helping science find the limitations of its models. That's right.
I'm just advocating for this maximal diagrammatic
Mm.
approach. I'm saying to understand the value, whether this principle is valid or not, impoverish it as much as possible and see what it becomes. And in that case, a lot of these things become reducible to things that are very impoverished, like, things that are going to persist. Um,
You had your
anyway,
date night last night. I got my date night tonight, so I better go. Uh,
always a pleasure, man.
yeah, lots of fun. And next week, let's do it again. We'll have to chat offline about what to. Oh, you can't do it next week.
I'm in
Oh,
India.
right.
I'm going to in leaving on Sunday and back on the 15th of November. So
Okay.
um,
Um,
after that, we'll work it out what we'll discuss.
second
But
half of November. We'll look ahead to then. All
cool.
right.
All right, man. Take care.
Have a good
Enjoy.
time. Have a good time in India. Hope you get some sleep tonight.
Have a good date.
Thanks. Take
See you,
care.
man.